And thank you, Kelsey, for starting us off with that awesome presentation. My name is Shohei, and today I'll be presenting on my thesis titled Examining Prison-Based Environmental Education as a Platform for Empowerment in a Correctional Setting and Beyond. Now, before I dive in, I want to take a second to briefly talk about COVID-19 as it's impacted all of our lives. The effects of COVID are amplified in prisons as we see outbreaks and deaths across prisons on a national and global scale. And in conducting research related to incarceration during a pandemic, just wanted to acknowledge the lives that were lost as well as those who were otherwise impacted by the pandemic. So I want to start off with this quote by a previously incarcerated individual who participated in an environmental education program in prison. And as you read this, I want to share a few statistics on the current state of mass incarceration within the US. Currently, 860 out of every 100,000 people are incarcerated in the United States. Every year, more than 700,000 people are released from federal and state prisons to return to outside communities. However, according to the US Department of Justice, almost 45% of people who are released from prison are arrested within 1 year of release. Now, this number increases as time goes on, with 68% arrested within 3 years, and then 79% within 6 years, and then 83% within 9 years. Now, systemic racism is also another issue as shown in this figure. When you look at the racial and ethnic disparities in a correctional setting, and in this case in Washington, numbers show that Black, Latinx, and Native American people are overrepresented, while white and Asian people are underrepresented. So a quick overview of what I'll be talking about for the next 10 minutes or so. First, I'll share my research questions, and I'll talk a little bit about the empowerment theory, which is the main theoretical framework that I used for my research. Then I'll talk about the first part of my research where I worked with previously incarcerated thesis advisors through focus group sessions to find out what empowerment looks like in a prison environment. And then I'll talk about the second part of my research where I conducted semi-structured interviews with previously incarcerated people to find out about their experiences in environmental education programs. So the two research questions that drove this thesis project were, what does it mean for individuals in marginalized and oppressed communities, and in my case, this would be prisons, to become empowered, and what tools are required for empowerment? And how can environmental education empower incarcerated people in a correctional setting and beyond? So what does it mean for someone to become empowered, right? Mark Zimmerman, who came up with the concept of empowerment theory, states that it's a value orientation for working in the community and a theoretical model for understanding the process and consequence of efforts to exert control and influence over decisions that affect one's life, organizational functioning, and the quality of community life. And so I bolded some of the key terms in this definition, but what does it look like from a theoretical framework point of view? So I have this visual model of Zimmerman's empowerment theory. Empowerment on an individual level refers to beliefs about one's competence and efforts to exert control over various aspects of their life. An empowering process on this level, on the individual level, may include things like learning decision-making skills and the ability to manage resources, while an outcome could be gaining a sense of control and critical awareness. So in a prison context, this means that an incarcerated person gaining empowerment on a personal level. Now, empowerment can also be observed within organizations or groups that undertake the process and as a result produce an outcome. An empowering process on this level might include things like shared responsibility and leadership. In prisons, empowerment on this level might happen within different programs or within a work environment. On a community level, it includes individuals as well as organizations or groups working together collaboratively to improve the community. Some empowering processes on this level include things like providing access to resources and encouraging diversity and inclusion. Now, in a prison setting, empowerment on a community level may happen within or across different programs, but it might also extend to outside of prisons as well. So In the first part of my research, I worked on finding out what empowerment looks like in a prison environment. And as someone who's never been incarcerated before, it was important to me that I got guidance and feedback from people with lived experience with incarceration. And so I collaborated with two formerly incarcerated thesis advisors to help me better understand this concept of empowerment in a prison context, and also to get feedback on thesis design moving forward. So through two focus group sessions with my thesis advisors, these are just some of the things that we worked on. So based on the conversations with the thesis advisors, I came up with these word clouds that outline some of the key terms associated with becoming empowered in prison, and also what causes people to become disempowered. Now, this process was helpful not only in helping me better understand empowerment in a prison context, but also because this set me up for the next section of my research looking at empowerment specifically within environmental education programs. So once I got feedback on my research design from the thesis advisors, I conducted semi-structured interviews with 5 previously incarcerated people who have experience in participating in prison-based environmental education programs. All participants were involved in programs offered through the Sustainability in Prisons project, and I focused on 3 specific programs that SPP offers based on the interviewees' experiences. And those were the Taylor's Checker Spot Butterfly Rearing Program and the Conservation Nursery Program, where they grow vegetated mats of native wetland plant species for habitat restoration. And then the Western Pond Turtle Rehabilitation Program, which helps deal with the turtle shell disease. So I then coded the interview data, and then these themes were identified. I don't have time to go over all these themes, but I do want to share just a few examples of themes associated with both empowerment and disempowerment. So I want to share a quote by a former conservation nursery technician who spoke about his experience in relation to finding purpose and significance, as well as responsibility and accountability. He said, "Every day you go into the greenhouse to see if the plants have grown at all, or if they start to pop up, and even the fish, how they grow every day and you feed them. It was such a wake-up call for me that I didn't need approval from people. I didn't need to hide who I was or what I couldn't do. It was a job. And the fish needed me, obviously. I needed to change their water. I needed to make sure they were healthy. I needed to make sure that the plants were healthy. So for me, it just gave me a purpose. It gave me self-worth. It gave me confidence. And honestly, those are things that sometimes you can't teach yourself." Another quote that I want to share is by a former turtle technician who spoke about how his participation in the program led to positive communication and interaction with a DOC officer. He said, "A good handful of the guards were super cool. They wouldn't just do their job, but they were actually interested in the turtles. They would come in and let me give my turtle spiel. They would just come in and check stuff out. They would come in and you can tell that they were genuinely just interested in stuff and saying hi. And you got to kind of drop that uniform for a minute and got to talk to them as people and not inmate to officer." So these were just some examples that illustrate signs of empowerment, but there were also instances in which people experienced disempowering situations. For example, one individual noted, "My least favorite thing about being out there in the program area was the dehumanizing part of having to beg and fight to be able to use a restroom. There was no restroom out there. At one point, there was a honey bucket, but they would lock it and it would be at the officer's discretion of whenever they felt like they would come around and unlock it and wait for us to use it. So there were officers who really used it as a power thing." So this isn't to say that all DOC staff are like that, because we work with some great people and none of the SPP programs would exist without their support and dedication. But this is also the reality of it, and people do frequently face these disempowering circumstances. So these are just some of the examples, but I was able to use all these data and do a little bit of analysis, which I'll explain next. So I took these interview data and ran some code analysis and created these 2 diagrams. Now, this diagram on the left shows the frequencies of codes that were associated with empowerment and disempowerment on the right side here, within different programs represented on the left. These green shaded areas connect the programs on the left to whether it was empowering or disempowering on the right. And the thicker this line is, the greater the frequency. So for example, within the butterfly program, this shaded area represents the frequencies of empowerment, while this next shaded area represents the frequencies of disempowerment within the program. Based on the thickness of both these shaded areas, it shows that signs of empowerment were observed more than disempowerment. So based on that analysis, signs of both empowerment and disempowerment were observed across all three programs, but codes associated with empowerment significantly outnumbered those related to disempowerment within all three programs. Moving on to the next diagram, I looked at the codes associated with empowerment to see how they fit into the three levels of the empowerment theory. Again, the frequencies are represented by the thickness of the green shaded areas, connecting the programs to each level of the empowerment theory. This shows that while empowerment may be observed in all three levels of the analysis, they were more aligned with the individual level than the organizational and community levels. And this finding was fairly consistent across all three programs, which suggests that empowerment as a result of participating in environmental education programs occurs predominantly on an individual level. Now, as I was coding my interview data, I also noticed instances where an interviewee would talk about one thing that would fall under multiple different codes. So based on that, I conducted a code co-occurrence analysis, and I drew networks to connect corresponding codes with co-occurring frequencies greater than 2. So this means that if someone talked about one thing that fell under 2 or more different code groups, that is considered to be co-occurring. And if that happened with the same 2 codes twice or more, I drew a network between those 2 codes. The codes were organized in 3 levels of empowerment. And as you can see with all these arrows connecting all the different codes, relationships exist between various codes across all levels. Now, this may indicate that while there were more signs of empowerment within the individual level, these are not necessarily constrained to one level of analysis as seen in these relationships. So then I adapted a concept map that was developed by Han et al., who studied empowerment in prison dog programs, and I created one for environmental education programs. Now, this diagram shows the environmental program as an intervention, and there are empowering processes and outcomes as a result of participating in these programs. But my research also showed that there are disempowering forces that negatively impact incarcerated people within both the process and outcome, often rolling back the efforts made within the program to make positive changes. So the main takeaways are that there were significantly more signs of empowerment than disempowerment across all 3 environmental education programs that I looked at, and that empowerment occurs on an individual level more than organizational and community levels. Also, empowering processes and outcomes are not constrained to one level of the empowerment theory, as relationships among various signs of empowerment exist across all levels of analysis. So these findings suggest that prison-based environmental education programs like those offered through SPP can serve as an ideal platform in which incarcerated people can gain a sense of empowerment. That said, there were also signs of disempowerment that can be observed in many of these programs that need to be addressed. So moving forward, all these findings may be helpful for the Department of Corrections as well as prison educators in increasing access to transformative and empowering education. And with that, I want to leave you with this quote by a former butterfly technician and open it up to any questions.